Good morning, Internet. Happy Sunday. So, today we want to make a couple of different videos, and the first one we want to talk about the following topic. Um, so, sort of the genesis of this project, or the genesis that sort of maybe the catalyst of this project was sort of just reflecting on the reason or potential reasons why I believed, falsely so, that I falsely believed, sort of that I couldn't learn to program. I had an sort of a misconception that programming was sort of exclusively for people who were really good at math, people who had started programming at a really young age. Sort of, I had a vision, a mental model of who could learn to program or should learn to program or would be good at learning to program, and I sort of excluded myself from that group, or self-selected out of that group. And I did that for 28, 29 years. Sorry, again, a new microphone, new ability to make awkward noises via recording. But returning to the thought, it just sort of, it was really interesting, sort of now having started down the journey of LTC, learning to code, the meta concept that for much, if not most, if not almost all of my life, I thought that I couldn't learn to program. Again, you could sort of argue that it wasn't all of my life, because for much of my life, in my childhood, I didn't know that programming was a thing, right? Which maybe in itself is a problem, whatever. But just, I find it really interesting how one could believe that he, she, or they are sort of not made of the material that would allow him, her, or them to learn to code. And so that was sort of the initial synthesis that got me to record first videos, which were even worse in quality than these. Not to put ourselves down, but there's a lot of opportunity to improve, let's put it that way. And so I think it's really interesting to dig into just the series of false beliefs that we may have, more particularly the macro false belief of one could or couldn't learn to program, and then sort of all of the associated or tangential false beliefs or beliefs around that, right? And so whether that is whether we're going to examine false beliefs or sort of the behaviors or experiences or thoughts that one might have while pursuing LTC, learning to code, that's maybe in quo, and big picture, big level, sort of how we think about the project. And so today we wanted to sort of discuss publicly, and we invite you to participate and give input on the following idea. And the following idea is that when you come to the space of learning to code, particularly if you're from a non-technical background, meaning like non-engineering, non-math background, maybe non-science background, just it can take a lot of effort to understand what each question is asking, right? So understanding what the problem is and what the problem is asking you to do in and of itself is often a material travail, like a material work or material objective, something to overcome. And so it's just really interesting now, having joined a variety of communities where there are other people sort of beginning their LTC journey, learning to code, and sort of discussing with them some of the ups and downs of learning to code, right? And in some ways, I can relate to those people in my program in the different communities who come from a place of a non-technical background, because that sort of describes me, at least in one angle. Right, so I didn't study math, I didn't study CS, obviously, I didn't study engineering, like MCE, any of that stuff, so some of just the logic constraints or the sort of the type of the descriptions of questions that one might experience in in a program like mine, or even in Free Code Camp, or LinkedIn Learning, whatever resources you're doing, just sort of the type of question and level of specificity or ambiguity can be very daunting. And I remember this sort of when I was first playing around with the idea of just not even learning to code, but just like learning some code. And in my mind, those are sort of different, which we could discuss later. But I think it was like in 2014, 2015, I came across Code Academy and their like first entry level learn to program classes or offerings, and I just like didn't understand what now seems very simple in terms of questions. I got frustrated, and for a variety of reasons, I just sort of put it aside. And then fast forward 4 to 5 years later, I'm like committed. I'm all in to LTC, learning to code. I like want to make this a career path, or potential career path, or a learning path at least for several months, if not several years, if not a lifetime. And so then I like joined this 1 month prep program for JavaScript, and I realized that during the exercises, so there were several hundred exercises, the first 50 or so, a lot of times I just had a really hard time sort of dissecting the question and understanding what my objectives were, right? So sort of what the question was asking, narrowing it down to the specific understanding so that I could then think about how to answer it, right? Because it was interesting in that sort of there are at least two parts. The first is like, what is the question asking? And then the second is like how to answer that question. And when you're first learning to code, depending on your background and your sort of orientation in nature, a lot of times if you're like me, at least initially, you won't even know the first part. You won't even understand sort of what the question is asking. And so therefore, by not understanding what the question is asking, you can't even really think about how to answer it, right? Because like that's like saying, if I were to ask you how old you are, and you were to say, and you were to not know what that means, right? You might say like, hello, or I'm Tolan, what is your name? Or, I would like 10 apples. There's just an infinite amount of things that you could respond to the question. If I were to ask how old you are and you don't know sort of what the question is asking you to do, right? You would potentially just pick whatever you think the most logical sort of frame of the question is, and you would respond in that way, and then you would probably be wrong, or you might be wrong, and sort of the being wrong could be frustrating, but then the being wrong because you don't understand the question, if that makes sense, is super frustrating. And imagine this happening multiple, if not dozens, if not almost every time that you come across a question. That is just that can be a very intense feeling, right? And then imagine that sort of being juxtaposed or put up against the fact that like you have this big desire or big interest in learning to code, right? Of like becoming more technical, of potentially pursuing a career in tech, or using your aspired acquisition of technical knowledge and know-how to like solve some form of problems or to boost your career or whatever. And if you can't even understand the question, how are you going to like become more technical or highly technical and apply it into your like future imagined self? And that's just really tough, right? And this sort of, in my mind, goes back to some of what we've been talking about in the earlier videos, and sort of one of the broad themes, I think, of this project is that I think it's interesting to consider how learning to code, again, not specific to learning to code, but in our context, learning to code, is as much a sort of a psychological and emotional adventure as it is a physical or technical or executional adventure, right? And I think, like, for me, learning something, right, but something different than what you're used to, in this case, like learning to code, is as much about managing your own psychology, particularly in the early stages, as it is about mastering the material. because when you're bad at something, depending on your orientation and your series of life experiences and what culture you grew up in and what family you grew up in and all of that stuff, a lot of it is just like about thinking and acknowledging how you deal with stress or failure or adversity or whatever you want to call it. They're just all of these psychological things that signal to you potentially very contrary information and create cognitive dissonance or just emotional baggage or emotional heat, whatever. And it's sort of up to you to figure out how to dissipate that heat, right? Sorry, that was like a lot of loose metaphors or analogies and terms. So coming back to this idea, it's sort of interesting to me, having now had the opportunity to speak with several dozen other people just about LTC, learning to code, and some of the community members here, just the fact of when you're first on the learning to code journey and first starting out, it can be a big burden just understanding what one question is asking for, and that can be such a struggle, such a source of frustration, such a frustration itself. But I think this is maybe personal or individual, right? And I think it's true for me. It might not be true for everyone, but I find it really interesting. Just if you, like, when you think about the learning to code journey, if you can find pleasure in sort of the challenge or the search and the discovery process, and then what I call the changement, like the state of change between not knowing and then knowing, and the delta between the two, that can be really, really powerful. So applied to the context of not knowing what the question is asking for, if you can just isolate to that, to a single question, right, where you don't know what the question is asking, I'm not sure if that's proper English, but whatever. I'm American. I don't speak English. I speak American English, whatever. Bad joke. But actually, I could speak in a fake British accent. Maybe that would make our videos way more interesting. It could also be quite offensive to people who speak proper English, but yeah, anyway, I'm going to switch back to American English, my native sort of way of speaking or accent. But just like going back to this idea, if you can sort of narrow in on just a single question and the state of your understanding of that question, right? So question number one, just if you can take pleasure in the fact that you might not understand what it's asking, and then at some point you may understand what it's asking, and that switch can be really, really powerful. Sort of related idea is that there's sort of benefit in accepting that you won't immediately understand every question, or there are questions that you may never understand, right? And the acceptance of non-understanding is a skill in and of itself. And then if you go from the single question model of like not understanding a single question and the delta of going from non-understanding to understanding, and you can sort of apply that as a pattern, meaning imagine you have 10 questions and you go through that, and then you look at the delta, and you can sort of start to intuitively or explicitly look for a pattern. Or maybe you have 100 questions and you look at that pattern and how it may change over time. At least for me and a number of people I've talked to, there's often some point, I can't say what number it is specifically or what type of question or whatever, but there's a point where you start to understand what questions are asking, or what certain types of questions are asking. And for me, that was like going back to the program that I did in JavaScript. There was like, say, 200 questions. It started out with like easy bowl questions, which at the beginning didn't seem at all easy, and then became increasingly more and more complex. At some point within sort of the bracket of easy questions, I started to understand some, and then many, and then most of the easy questions and what they were asking for. And again, that's like very separate than sort of understanding how to properly answer or respond to the easy question. That's a different sort of question or different skill or different part of the process. But it was just interesting in sort of understanding or seeing or realizing that I was starting to understand at least some type of question, some types of question, or some category of like the easier questions. And then if you sort of delay for a little bit and progress in my journey, then I started to understand some of the medium questions, and then a couple hard questions, and then most of the medium questions, and then most of the hard questions. At least in sort of the 200 questions that I was asked, because you start to see patterns, and you start to have sort of these, again, like mental models of what the question might be asking, and then you sort of can like narrow it down. So anyway, this is just to say, for those of you or those of us that are still kind of early stage startups, no, but early stage learning to code ups, whatever you want to call us. But the people sort of initially on the LTC journey who are struggling or emotional or sort of have some level of emotional response around just getting to a place where you understand what the question in front of you is asking. I would say from personal experience that there is hope, that there's a likelihood that if you keep working at it, that there may be a time where you start to understand more and more of the questions and more of what the questions are asking for, and then at some point like more and more of how to respond to each question. For me, I think it's sort of a numbers game. It's a numbers game, but also a numbers game that you can influence in terms of like asking for help, if you're part of a community, or asking a mentor, or asking a classmate, or asking someone in our community sort of how they understand questions, because a lot of times understanding the different learning processes and the different sort of thinking process of how to just a question can be really helpful in this journey. So this video has been going on really for a long time. In summary, we wanted to sort of just look at the phenomenon or a phenomenon within the LTC journey, which is understanding, or often initially misunderstanding or not knowing what a question is asking for, and the sort of the psychological or emotional responses that can come with that. We discussed how it's pretty common for people, particularly people with a non-technical background, and it can be incredibly frustrating. I discussed a little bit my own experience and used the example of the 1-month program where I was learning JavaScript, and sort of within a subset of 200 problems, I started to see patterns and sort of to unlock or unblock at least the initial part of understanding what the question was asking for. And I guess we sort of talked about different strategies or my experience and how you might think about that. So in summary, we've given you that. In call to action, or sort of just like asking the community, we would love to know what you think about this phenomenon of understanding the question. We would love to sort of know what your experience is. Have you experienced this, whether it's in the learning to code journey or elsewhere? Do you have any strategies or tips that you can offer others within the community? Have you tried things that work versus tried things that haven't worked? We would love to know that. And then sort of as a separate bucket, we are always interested in comments and input and feedback, particularly constructive feedback, on how we could make this video, future videos, better, right? So like what if anything do you like about these videos? What if anything do you not like? Do you have sort of certain types of contents or certain styles of videos that you are interested in seeing within our channel, within our community? Are there things that you find much less interesting? We'd love to know that too. Sort of as the common practice, there is a link to a Google form, so it's sort of like a survey that you can fill out if you want to sort of give explicit feedback in a way that we can easily digest it, or you can just leave comments or the like or dislike thing. That's sort of a signal too. Lastly, for those of you that want to stay up to date, I think there's a subscribe button. Feel free to check that out. No pressure either way. And yeah, just want to say thanks. Like, it's been really fun working on this project and engaging with all of you, or I guess we're not engaging with all of you. Whatever, that's a sort of a debate, but those of you that are engaging back, we really value that. We really enjoy that. So thanks for helping make the project awesome, and we'll see you again later today, tomorrow, some other day, maybe never again. But either way, hope you have a great afternoon, great life, a great day, whatever. But yeah, thanks for watching. Okay.